First, I have to recognize two of our board members who are not able to be with us, but who were instrumental in arranging for today's presentation. We are honored to have returning to COLERA two people who are very well known, especially throughout Central Ohio. Dr. Herb Asher is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at The Ohio State University. I previously served as counselor to the University President, Senior Vice President for Government Affairs, Special Assistant to the University President for Government Relations, and Founding Director of the John Glenn Institute for Public Service and Public Policy. He is frequently called upon, like he is today, as an expert political analyst by local and national media. You've probably seen him on TV a time or two. His degrees are from Bucknell and the University of Michigan. Dr. Asher serves as faculty advisor to a number of student organizations, including the Ohio State University College Democrats, in case you're wondering which perspective he's going to be providing in our conversation today. Also serves on the executive committee and board of trustees of Hillel, and formerly served as faculty advisor to the undergraduate student government, college Republicans, and to two fraternities. So he's actually advised both sides. He's a former member and chair of the Ohio Ethics Commission and currently a member of MORPC, the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. He was also a member of the Ohio Constitutional Modernization Commission. And I might just have questions about that and how you think that process went.
I gotta go now.
Yeah, right. It was a very productive commission, I'm sure, but he's also a member of the Constitutional Modernization Commission and a member of the Board of Trustees for Equality Ohio, former member of the Board of Trustees of Community Research Partners.
Stop already.
So he's got a lot of stuff on his resume. And then let me just tell you about Terry before we turn it over to her. Terry Casey's graduate of Ohio State with business administration and journalism studies. He's worked over 5 decades with state legislators, including Speaker Joanne Davidson, judges, mayors, state office holders, members of the Congress, community groups, schools, etc., for research and media on various public policy issues. He's a former administrative assistant to Columbus Mayor Tom Moody and Congressman Sam Devine. Franklin County Board of Elections, board member for 14 years and board chairman. He's the former chairman of the State Board of Voting Machine Examiners. And since January 2011, he's been chair of the State Board of Personnel Review, and he was appointed to that position by Governor Kasich. He has been a regular panelist on WOSU Columbus on the Record for the last 11 years, and you will frequently see him on WCMH, Colleen Marshall's Spectrum show, and Channel 10's Face the State, and other similar organizations or similar media outlets. He also is extensively involved in community service, including on the library board and where he served as board president. And he is also a member of the Ohio Library Trustee Hall of Fame. And Terry has also traveled quite extensively around the world to 23 different countries and 6 continents. So we have invited Herb and Terry to be with us to give their analysis of the election. We ordinarily would have done this in November, but we weren't sure if we would know the results of the election in November. So we decided to schedule it in December instead. And since the Electoral College did make it official yesterday, I think we can all finally say that Joe Biden is going to be the next president of the United States. So we'll be interested in hearing their analysis of what the results of the election mean nationally and here in Ohio, and in particular, perspectives on what that means for labor and employment relations moving forward. So I give you Dr. Herb Asher and Terry Casey, and Herb, I think you're going to start, right?
Yeah, Terry and I are going to alternate. We decided that if one of us spoke for too long a period of time without a break, you all would be, your eyes would glaze over. But we do know the election is over because yesterday or this morning, both Vladimir Putin and Mitch McConnell congratulated Joe Biden. So this is very reassuring. it's good to be with a mature audience. Oftentimes I'm on campus and I'm talking with students, and a mature audience, many of you, actually some may have actually been alive at this time, would remember that there was once a president who had on his desk a placard that said, "The buck stops here." And also many of you would remember that there was something called the Cold War. And for many students, the Cold War is sort of the battle between Miller Lite and Bud. But the real Cold War is something that the West won, and it was a major foreign policy accomplishment. And I just happened to mention those two things, not with having any contemporary president in mind or whatever, but I just thought I'd say that. But I'm supposed to start talking about what happened in Ohio. And what's interesting is we know until 2016, Ohio was considered to be a bellwether state, one of the most competitive states. And then in 2016, Donald Trump had an impressive victory, won by 8 points in Ohio, defied the polls, which showed a closer race. And then in 2018, except for the Supreme Court races, the Republicans swept the statewide administrative office. I'm leaving out Sherrod Brown here, but the statewide administrative offices, all by a margin of 4 to 5 points, even though the Democrats had a very good ticket, both sides were adequately funded and all of that. So going into 2020, about a year ago, a lot of people said, well, Ohio is not really going to be as competitive. The candidates are not going to be focusing on Ohio. We're losing our bellwether status, and we're becoming a pink state, if you will. And that's really the way the year began. And then we had, over the course of the year, a number of polls that showed the state to be very close. And all of a sudden, we were sort of rediscovered as a competitive state. And we certainly saw on the GOP side many, many visits to Ohio by the president and the vice president. But on election day, it was basically a repeat of 2016. Trump had an impressive victory in Ohio. The Republicans picked up seats in the Ohio House and the Ohio Senate. There aren't many seats left for them to pick up, so it was really quite impressive. And the congressional delegation basically stayed the same. And the only place in which the Democrats showed any signs of progress was, again, picking up one more Supreme Court seat after they picked up 2 in 2016. So I just want to, and Terry and I will talk a little bit about the importance of the Supreme Court to all of us. So what's happening in Ohio that is making us more of a red state? We're not a deep red state. Democrats still have some hopes of winning statewide, but now the Democratic hopes are more dependent upon the Republicans screwing up. Republicans having major intra-party battles or Republicans having major scandal. The Democrats really are weaker, and they're weaker not just because at a party organizational level, but also at the grassroots. So just very quickly, Western Ohio, which has always been very Republican, is even more Republican these days. And when you see counties along the Indiana border, which Donald Trump carried with 81% of the vote, that's an amazing accomplishment. And I think part of it is those are conservative areas, socially conservative areas. And what do they see in the Democratic Party nationally? A very, very liberal party, a party that's further away from them than they saw in the past. In northeastern Ohio and along the river, Mahoning flipped this time. And of course, the white working class has moved away from the Democratic Party. And that's for a variety of reasons, but certainly one, again, is the sense that, at least at the national level, with the exception of people like Sherrod Brown, Democratic Party doesn't seem to be as concerned about the white working class as they once were. Southeastern Ohio, which used to have more of a Democratic tinge, in part because of white migration from the South, which was heavily Democratic, but those Democrats were fairly conservative Democrats, conservatives on issues of race and social issues. And they've also seen the Democratic Party, they perceive, move further away from them and not be as concerned about them. And in particular, coal miners see the Democratic Party as, in many cases, the enemy. So there are parts of the state where the Democrats have lost support. There are parts of the state where Democrats have made some gains. And for those of us in Central Ohio, we can remember once that Franklin County used to be more Republican than the state at large. If Republicans got 50% of the vote in statewide, they got more than that in Franklin County. And now we're seeing Franklin County and Hamilton County moving much more Democratic. And we're also seeing some of what I call the ring counties, and I'll use just Delaware as one example, highly prosperous, highly educated white counties. And it turns out that that Biden did better than Clinton in Delaware County, and Clinton did better than Obama. So there are some movements in the Democratic direction, but the voter movements have been netted out in terms of an advantage for the GOP. And so the GOP really right now is the dominant party. Terry and I'll probably come back to that, but let me pass over to Terry.
Appreciate it. I always enjoy Herb talking about the problems of the Democrat Party. I'd love to throw a little gasoline on that, but that's always fun. I'm going to disagree with him a little bit because the question is, have the Republicans become that strong? And I think part of it is in some of the races like the state legislative, they've had either better candidates and or better campaigns.
Or better defense.
Yes, different factors, but it's amazing the state Senate, and I was just involved the past couple of weeks in a recount in a state Senate district there that was originally 41 votes, then 116, and then 130 votes. But to think that the state Senate is down now out of 33 seats to only having 8 Democrats. So you've got 4 leaders of the Senate Democrats and 4 people to be led. It's really a challenge there with the body shrinking up. And obviously on some of the shows that Herb and I have done earlier in this season, the fact that you had the Larry Householder House Bill 6, some call it scandal, indictments, et cetera, and yet there weren't more gains as part of the amazement. But Ohio is changing somewhat, but again, how much of that's the strength of one party, the weakness of the other? My sense is there's still a lot of balance in Ohio, but in this election, turnout was one of the key issues, not so much in Franklin County, but if you look at within Cleveland, you look within Cincinnati, people will tell you the African-American vote was not very energized. Their turnout was below average compared to some of the other voter groups. The tighter Ohio Supreme Court is going to make things interesting, and we can talk some more about this later, but with the margin being 4-3 and Maureen O'Connor as Chief Justice, she's shown on some issues in the past like gerrymandering where she's not a lockstep Republican or conservative vote. So I think the Ohio Supreme Court is going to be interesting as they approach issues. And if you've looked at it in the last 4 years, they've had a lot of decisions where the coalitions don't shape up in the normal partisan type of manner. We can talk some more later about this little thing called the state budget. It didn't get talked about much in the last election, partly because COVID dominated things so heavily. And at least as of a month ago, the state's revenue is pretty much meeting estimate. The expenditures are about estimate or slightly below. So the good news as of today is that the state budget is fairly good shape, and they still haven't touched any of the $2.7 billion rainy day fund. But in late January to February, the governor's got to propose a budget, and then the House and Senate have got to take at it, because the reality is, number one, for the next 30 months, almost nobody can predict exactly what revenue and expenditures are going to do or go, or maybe a roller coaster up and down. And then obviously there's a lot of issues like Bob Cupp in the Ohio House, and I've known him since 1984, very solid, good guy. He has an idea of what he wants to do on school funding. On the other hand, his compatriot as a state senator, who'll be the next Senate president, Matt Huffman, is very much of the view, wait a minute, Bob, before we pass a new school funding formula. We want to know, what is the price tag? How much does it cost? And how are you going to pay for it in future years? So the legislature is going to have some really key issues on figuring out the budget, figuring out the priorities. And it's no secret that there's a certain tension right now between the governor and the legislature over certain of the issues. Part of it, if you talk to some of the governor's people, they'll tell you that it's been harder in the past 6 to 9 months for the governor to interact personally with legislators. They're kind of operating at arm's length, and needless to say, as James Madison designed it, we want a healthy tension between the legislative and executive branches, and we've got it in Ohio, and we'll see how it plays out in the first 6 months. So, and then there's the whole question of, what do the Ohio House and the state Senate Democrats do as their numbers have shrunk up? What role, what fights do they want to pick? What issues do they want to go after? So in Ohio, we've got some interesting issues and questions, but I think for the first 6 months, the legislature, the governor, how do you figure out a budget? What other issues are priority? That's some of what's going to be top on the plate. And I might also mention, I'm kind of speaking as a person that does some TV programs. I'm not speaking on behalf of the state board I'm on or any other state boards, but it has been interesting to follow state government. And obviously this state government has little issues. I don't know whether it'll come up, but I'm sure the governor's going to get the question. Once you've approved vaccines for people that are frontline healthcare workers and people in nursing homes, where are the priorities from there in terms of prison guards versus prisoners, people who like Herb and I that are slightly over age 60, where do we fit in the priorities? Where do teachers? There's a whole lot of questions that the governor, maybe not the legislature, is going to have to deal with, but there's going to be no shortage of things to talk about or litigate in the coming months.
You know, moving back to the national level, you know, before the election, the polls, and we don't need to talk about the frailty of polls, but the polls were suggesting it was going to be a very good Democratic year. There was even the phrase, perhaps a Democratic wave. Well, if you actually look at the national results, obviously the Democrats are thrilled that Biden won, but the Democrats had hopes that they were going to, on election day, have won the US Senate. They did not. We'll get to Georgia shortly, but, and on the House, they lost a number of seats. And they were also hoping to flip some state legislatures in other states. That did not happen. So election night in 2020 was a very good night for the Republicans, except for the president. And as Terry said, the turnout overall was very impressive. And the Republicans, again, nationally had a lot of successes. Now, as we all know, there are 2 Senate seats that are still up for grabs, and those are the runoff elections in Georgia. And should the Democrats win both of them, well, the Senate would be tied 50-50, and then Vice President Kamala Harris would be the tie-breaking vote. And what's fascinating about this, of course, Joe Biden won Georgia by a narrow margin. The president now has been PO'd, that is President Trump, at the governor and the Secretary of State, attacking the process, attacking the vote in Georgia. At the same time, he's campaigning for the 2 Republican candidates for Senate to, in fact, get elected, keep the Democrats from controlling everything. And I think the conventional wisdom is, well, turnout in a runoff election is usually lower, maybe substantially lower. Therefore, that should be of help to the Republicans, but nobody's quite sure about that. And so you're going to see 2 elections in which the current president, the president-elect, the former president are all campaigning. Surrogates will be there. Money will be flowing in. and nobody's sort of quite sure about the outcome. Although I think people think the Republicans would certainly be favored to win one seat, and not quite sure about the other one. So in some ways, the 2020 election continues, and once we know that outcome, and should the Republicans maintain control of the Senate, then we're back to really split government, narrow Republican margin in the Senate, narrow Democratic margin in the House, and a Democratic president who has been known to work across the aisle and certainly used to be considered a person of the Senate. So we'll see how that goes and see whether, in fact, next year there is some progress made on a variety of issues. But like the state level, the national government is facing some major issues. And one thing that Terry and I have talked about, the state government has to have a balanced budget. The federal government can just turn on the printing presses, and we're old timers. So when we would hear, well, they just passed a $2 trillion package for this, or there's a proposal for $1 trillion for that, and there used to be a senator by the name of Ed Dirksen who used to say $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and before you know it, it adds up. And now we're talking in trillions, and we are so fortunate as a nation that the interest rates we pay on our debt are so low, because otherwise we could really have a horror scenario coming up very quickly. Terry?
Well, Herb did correctly note that big difference of Mike DeWine and the Ohio General Assembly does not have a printing press, and they just can't print the money. And obviously the feds are still trying to work out this week what kind of a package they put together. But to pick up on the point about this election, in reality, in some ways, Donald Trump is half right. The election was fairly close because in 3 states, Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, the total vote margin was about 42,000. But in all due respect, 42,000 votes compared to Florida in 2000, when it was a few hundred, 40-some thousand is a pretty wide margin. And I forget, Herb might know the number, but when Trump originally won his so-called landslide then, he had about 3 states that had a comparable kind of margin of a few thousand. So
the total across Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin was a total of 70,000.
Right. But this time you had 40,000 and 40-some thousand in those 3 states. So it was very close. But one of the points that I made on one of the radio programs I did last week is there was, quote, fraud in this election. But was it massive and significant to make a difference? The answer is no. And I'll give you a little example. In Franklin County, there were 387 people who probably committed fraud legally because they voted provisionally, or excuse me, they voted by absentee, and then they walked in on election day and tried to vote provisionally. Now, in their defense, I don't think there was criminal intent because there were about 49,000 people that got the wrong ballot. Example, some in Worthington got a ballot for Whitehall, and then they had to resend them out. So there was people that had legitimate confusion. So there always are mistakes. There is some mischief a little bit, but it certainly didn't add up to 40-some thousand votes. And also there was a lot of confusion in this election on absentee mail voting, which is pretty established, versus mailing out live ballots. So needless to say, there was lots of noise in this election, but getting back to governing, it's still very close. And obviously in Georgia, I don't think either Herb or I have any idea what's going on there because there's an obscene amount of money, as if they weren't worn out prior to the election with all the ads and mail and phone calls. Now, since November, they've had 2 straight months of more and more and more of the stuff. So Georgia is going to have the last word, but my sense of it is whether it's 51 seats or 52 seats, it's probably going to be Mitch McConnell in the driver's seat there. And I might also mention nationally, contrary to some of the reports that the Supreme Court has been stacked and Republican judges have been stacked and they would rule with the president. He got a rude awakening in Pennsylvania, where you had a trial court judge, former Republican chairman, 3 appeals court judges, then there was a federal judge appointed by Trump in Wisconsin. They all ruled against him, and then the US Supreme Court, supposedly maybe 6-3 more conservative, 9-0, they said to Texas, thanks, but no thanks. We aren't going to get in the middle of that kind of thing. So in some ways, Donald Trump wanted a conservative Supreme Court. He kind of got it because they didn't want to legislate from the bench, and they didn't jump in and do what he might have liked for them to do.
Yeah, let me make 2 gentle comments about our outgoing president. And my guess is part of his disappointment with the Republican judges is his total absence of understanding what the role of the judiciary is. And instead, again, he's very transactional, and he probably thought, well, I appointed you, so you owe me one. And that's the way, that's the way he's always operated or whatever. But more significantly, his performance in the post-election period, just constantly talking about fraudulent, now not making tempered comments, but making just outrageous comments about it's rigged, it's fraudulent, it's stolen or whatever. And there still are many, many Americans now who believe it was rigged. A large proportion of Republicans believe that. That's a hell of a way for a new president to come into office with lots of people thinking it's rigged. But more importantly, it makes us look like a banana republic across the world. Oh my God, we're always talking about elections in one of the, one of the stands near Russia or in South Asia. He's now reinforcing this, that our election system is just like any other corrupt country. It's rigged. That's such a disservice to the country, and we'll see how well we get past that. But the silence, the acquiescence of 17 attorneys general with the Texas suit, that's so disappointing. It was so reassuring that David Yost, actually our own attorney general, said no to that. He would not participate in that. So we have some healing to do, and we'll see whether or not we can accomplish that. And again, I think the president-elect, Biden, has certainly said over and over and over again, I'll be the president of all the people. It doesn't matter whether you voted for me or not. He's trying. And now we'll have to see, as Terry is saying, how does the governing process actually play out? And split control, assuming then that Georgia keeps the Republicans in the majority, split control with narrow margins in the House and the Senate, and a president who does have skills at negotiating may in fact do a lot to try to demonstrate to the American people that we can work together, that the process is legitimate, that everybody has some input into the process. But perhaps for those at the right-wing extreme and the left-wing extreme, they don't want to see compromise. It's their way or the highway. It's all or nothing or whatever. So that is worrisome.
Scott, I don't know whether we want to kind of pause briefly and see from what we've talked about so far, what questions anyone in the audience has, because again, Herb and I can go on, but we don't want to put people to sleep. So Scott, either a question from you or anybody else?
Well, let me suggest at this point, for anybody who would like to ask a question, just please in the chat note that you have a question, and I'll try to make sure that I get to everybody and call people in order. While you're thinking about that, I guess I'm interested in, I was going to ask you, and I think you just commented about, the impact of Donald Trump's sowing doubt in the integrity of the election process. And I'm curious if you can comment further, what do you think is going to be the lasting impact on that? When you have large percentages, particularly of Republican voters, that don't see this election as legitimate, what does that mean for the future of our democracy from your from your perspective.
Well, from my view, I'm going to jump in and indicate, in a way, this is clearly Trump has taken it to a much higher level. But starting in 2000 with George W. Bush's election, there was a huge amount of accusation, disbelief, things that the election was fraudulent and the president wasn't legitimate. It wasn't quite as much in Obama's 2 elections, but clearly Donald Trump feels, rightly or wrongly, that after his election in 2016, the accusations of the Russians rigging the elections, et cetera, his view was that that damaged him. So going back to 2000, we've had a lot of tensions over that. I think the previous most close election was 1960, when Nixon was urged to stir up what Mayor Daley did in Chicago and the question of Illinois' results. But we had a period like when Ronald Reagan won both times, it was pretty wide margins. Bill Clinton won by a wide margin, though there was an independent there that drained off some of the votes. But we've had some history of late of questions, and I think part of it is now with cable TV and the internet, and also social media, it's a lot easy, if you believe what you believe, to not only say it, but go and find people who will cheer you on. And in some ways, I think that's gasoline on the fire on both sides that contributes to a lot of the distrust and other things that go on.
Yeah, what's different about 2 of the examples that Terry cited, the Gore-Bush election, there were Democratic activists who really felt that the election was taken from them, but it wasn't led by Al Gore. Al Gore and Bill Clinton actually behaved perfectly appropriately. And Hillary Clinton certainly was not leading, the accusations that Trump stole the election. This is the president of the United States. These are not his flunkies doing it. This is the president of the United States out there. That makes it even worse. And as to, when we get past this and people start looking at Russia and other countries for that matter, they'll get a better sense that the kind of interference, at least to me, is more worrisome, is not that they're manipulating or changing votes directly or getting into our voting databases. It's all the crap that they put out on Facebook and other social media, in which they're really telling all sorts of lies about the party they don't like. I mean, and look, Putin understands this much better than many Americans do about the ability to spread false information and try to create division. So I think of the Russians as really trying to divide the United States. And in some ways, maybe they prefer Donald Trump to be reelected, but in fact, they're probably loving this period because, we're divided by race, we're divided by our views on a lot of issues, and now we may be divided about the integrity of our election system. And as much as some people will scoff at the Russians' ability to do this, they've been doing this in Western Europe for decades. They have interfered in German elections and British elections. And again, it's not tampering with the vote. It's getting messages out there that are likely to create some element of destabilization, polarization, or whatever. So that's what I worry about. And that's something I think we should, as a country, worry about going forward, because anybody or any institution can be the target of that.
Lori Rotterman has a question. Lori, if you want to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, so my question is, after the Georgia runoff, assuming that both Democrats do win seats, and it's 50-50 and Kamala Harris is the tiebreaker, how is the Senate leadership determined? For instance, who's the majority leader if there is no majority?
The Democrats will organize the Senate under that circumstance because you will have, as the vice president, the tie-breaking vote. So there will not be a shared, half the committee chairs are Republican, half are Democratic. It will be a Senate that's organized by the Democrats.
And the thing to watch is a guy to the south of us named Joe Manchin, because if it would be 50-50, he is in a state that went heavily for Trump and is much more conservative. And Joe Manchin is certainly not as liberal as some in the Democrat caucus or majority of 50 would be. So there'd be a lot of interesting trade-offs. And of course, there's also some Republicans who are not as conservative as some others.
Yeah, I think following up on Terry's point, I'm pretty confident that Manchin will stay as a Democrat. He was critical, but you can probably be assured that in any major spending bill, there will be major dollars for projects in West Virginia, whether they need those projects or not.
All right,
Thanks.
thank you.
Alan Kinzer, asking about redistricting. I have redistricting questions too. Go for it.
Thank you. My question is about Ohio's new redistricting process and whether you think it will actually be effective in creating more competitive districts in our state.
I'll jump in first. In some ways, and of course, it depends on what you define as an improvement. But first of all, fair disclosure, there's no way that you're going to have every congressional Ohio House and state Senate district being perfectly compact, equally competitive, all the communities of interest held, because that's almost physically impossible to do, particularly for congressional races where the courts have said each district must be exactly equal. In the Ohio House and the state Senate, they got a little more flexibility, because if you're a whole county, like Allen County is, or Columbiana County, it can be plus or minus 10%. The other districts could be plus or minus 5%. They got a little more flexibility, but clearly in certain ways, it's definitely going to be better, because the people drawing the maps have to look at the Ohio Supreme Court, where Maureen O'Connor voted against the last plan when it came through. So clearly the Democrats have 3 votes there in the Supreme Court. You got Maureen O'Connor, who could go either way. So they're definitely going to make them better, but don't expect everything to be perfect, because there's just no way politically, unless you draw a district that starts in Holmes County and goes up into the inner city of Akron or Cleveland, that you can make every one of the 99 Ohio House districts equally competitive. So they'll be more competitive, they'll be better, but how much better is going to be challenging, because Ohio is such a large and diverse state. And again, you've got to, if you start out drawing like 99 Ohio House districts, the first 5 counties might be whole county districts. And then the next 5, 6, 8 districts will look pretty good. But then you're always going to have bits and pieces here and there. And where do they go? So drawing maps in Ohio is not easy. So there's still going to be some weird shapes and twists and turns.
I agree. We'll have a few more competitive districts. And I also believe that the Democrats will pick up some seats in the Ohio House, not many, because elections are also determined not by the boundaries of the districts, but by the quality of the candidate recruitment, by the amount, the experience of successfully organizing campaigns, the ability to fund campaigns or whatever. But the playing field will be somewhat more level. But I'm curious to see how the process actually unfolds and whether or not we wind up getting a redistricting plan that has sufficient number of minority members supporting it that allows it to be a 10-year plan, or whether or not it'll be a 4-year plan. I think from the point of view of the Republican Party, that's not too much of a worrisome thing right now, given the tremendous advantage it has in incumbency, organization, finances, and all of that. Terry, is it your sense still that we're going to lose the 1 congressional seat?
That's the best guess, that we'll lose 1 congressional seat. And obviously, there's people on both Republican and Democrat side who are not big fans of Tim Ryan. His district's in question, plus the huge population shrinkage in northeastern Ohio is going to have its effects. So there's a potential that a member of Congress is going to lose out, but part of that's going to depend. Does Jim Jordan decide he wants to run for governor in 2022, in which case they might wipe out the district? Clearly, Fudge's district and here in central Ohio, that district, because they're both held by African Americans, you've got to protect and strengthen, not water down those districts. So that's part of putting the coalition in. As I recall, I think in the current session of the General Assembly, 18 of the 132 members are African American, which actually matches the Ohio population. So there's going to be a strong feeling of don't dilute the number of African Americans in the Ohio General Assembly, which means you can do some things, but you can't do other things.
Well, I was involved with redistricting in 2005, and it was a very painful experience. And there were some African American members of the General Assembly from the Cleveland area who fervently believed that they needed their overwhelmingly African American districts in order to win, because the racism was so bad in Cleveland. And Republicans were more than happy to give them overwhelmingly African American and therefore Democratic districts, because you were packing Democrats into a smaller number of districts. There were other African American members who said, no, 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 we don't need 80% or 70% districts. What we need are 35, 40% districts, as long as the other 60% aren't all Republican. I mean, they are. And if we do that, then we can pick up more seats, and some of those seats will be won by white Democrats, but we'll have a better chance of either being a much larger minority party or maybe even in the majority someday. So as Terry's saying, this is one of those balances and one of those internal discussions that you don't oftentimes see on the front page or whatever, that will have a lot to say about what happens in the Cleveland area, what happens in Columbus and Cincinnati for that matter. So we have a new process, and I think it'll create a few more competitive districts, and I think maybe provide some opportunity for the Democrats to make some marginal gains. But there's still a lot of other discretionary things that can happen. And then other civil rights constraints, as Terry is alluding to, that also need to be addressed also.
All right, thanks. And I think there was a follow-up question in the chat that you addressed about the 10-year versus 4-year map prospects too. We're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about some labor relations issues. Mita, you want to go ahead and say your question?
Yes, I was just questioning what the potential changes to the labor policy would be at the National Relations Board. Under Trump, there was a lot of changes he made through rule or substantive rulemaking authority that he had with his board, and what impact you think that the Biden-Harris would have on the labor policy moving forward.
Well, part of the question will be answered after we know the Georgia results, because if Republicans win the 2 seats there, Mitch McConnell's got more muscle to question and say who's going to be appointed. And I don't know what the current makeup is of the NLRB. And as I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, NLRB is a little more on the private sector, whereas in Ohio for public employees, it's a little more, what does state law, what does the Ohio Supreme Court say? So it could have its impacts, but I think there's, again, one of the shifts, as I understand, of unions in the past 50 or 60 years in America, it shifted from being more of a private sector union force to more of a public employees union. And clearly Ohio, even with Householder as speaker, and with DeWine as governor and even Kasich, there was no push to make Ohio right to work or to do anything that people like in 2011 thought was too extreme in terms of taking away bargaining rights.
I think, this is really not my area of expertise, but I think I would look to see what did Trump do that he was able to do as president without the agreement of Congress, and whether it dealt with executive orders or rules or administrative procedures or whatever, and what could be undone by the next president. I don't think with a split Congress, you're going to see major changes in labor policy. Even if the Democrats win both chambers, I'm not sure with narrow margins they're going to tackle that. So I think the first thing to look at is what can you do via the regulatory, administrative, and executive order to do some things that organized labor would want to see happen.
So Sandra has a follow-up question on that point, though, in terms of presidential authority. Sandra, do you want to go ahead and read your question?
Well, yes, I, as an arbitrator, have sometimes over the past 4 years had cases with federal sector public employees, and and the employer, and they said, well, we can't do this because of Trump's executive order. We can't do that because of Trump's executive order. We can't settle the case. Even if you find in favor of the union on this, we're not going to be able to implement the award. And I don't remember the executive order number, but I'm wondering if that's on, if anybody knows if that's on President-elect Biden's radar to do something about that.
Well, I don't know, but I would assume if it really literally is an executive order that can be undone, it will be undone. If it is that simple. Yeah.
And part of it, you got to remember the U.S. Supreme Court has changed somewhat. Again, Trump was highly disappointed in the U.S. Supreme Court and what they didn't do, but there's still a pretty solid majority there. And there's also cases such what happened in the union case decided by the Supreme Court 5-4. A lot of public employee unions thought the world would come to an end out of that decision. And as it ended up, the world didn't come to an end. Part of it, at least people tell me, the unions realized this might be coming, and they made some smart adjustments in how they communicated and worked with their members, and the members better understood the value of being part of the union. Now, I think there's still, I don't know whether it's state or federal, a case coming on when members can opt out and by what method. So clearly the US Supreme Court being 6-3 more conservative, but I'd also argue the Chief Justice, as he did on the Obamacare case, is not as conservative as what some people might view him compared to Justice Thomas and 1 or 2 others. So clearly the US Supreme Court is going to be a good guessing game as far as what they do and what cases are headed their way.
All right, thanks. Jeff Wensing.
Yeah, I placed in the chat, I was just interested in your opinion if you believe that Trump has changed the landscape for campaigning for the next generation, or kind of in the last debate it was more orderly, and do you believe that it will return to some semblance of how it used to be, or are we going in a new direction for a while?
Well, my sense is, particularly with social media, the media environment changing the way it is, things are always going to be changing. But I'd also argue from a friend who did some media work with Trump in 2016, he made the point there were a lot of candidates who saw what Trump did and then they wanted to be Trump. But the reality is they weren't as good at it, good in quotes, whatever that means, as what Trump was. So you can try and adopt his style or way of doing things, but that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be able to pull it off and achieve success. So copying what one politician did doesn't necessarily mean the next one can pull it off, because times change and people are different. And also, like with TV shows, sometimes people get tired of watching something and they want to shift gears. So, maybe it could happen, but politicians and times change.
It's certainly not going to go back to we'll call it the old way, because unless the media went back to the really old way of 3 networks with Walter Cronkite, look, what's happening here is who gives oxygen to a candidate like Trump? The media. I mean, CNN may say they hate him, but they love him. He's good for ratings, and they just cover everything. So you're creating incentives for candidates to be outrageous. But I agree with Terry. I don't think there are a lot of candidates out there who can be as outrageous as Trump and get away with it. I mean, it's amazing how good he was at this. It took the media a long time to understand that his was the communication of distraction. He says something false, a lie. Well, you don't answer that question. You go on to the next lie or the next accusation or the next thing. And he actually, I thought in many cases, was playing the media like the proverbial fiddle. He was so good at it. It was so natural. He had such the ability to be asked a question and to answer a very different question or turn that into an attack. And maybe there are candidates who can be as good as that. But remember, he came into this with extensive experience on television, on reality TV. He had an image that this whole thing was really a giant reality TV show in which he set the rules. And so I don't know that I think other people may try this. And look, there's certain things that he did. If you have candidates who think that being anti-immigration, with really nasty terms about immigrants and Mexicans or whatever, or somebody who really believes that I just need to have the police and the blacks fighting each other and I'll be on the side of that. That's going to happen. There have been variations of that for a long time. But in some ways, the callous and crude way he did some of these things, I'm not sure other candidates are going to be either, first of all, credible in doing it, convincing in doing it, and being able to carry it off. But are we going to go back to a more civilized? Terry made a very important point here. Watch and see how many candidates run. If you have a field of 15, how do you separate yourself? Well, my guess is initially you don't separate yourself by giving the thoughtful, erudite, rational answers to questions on these debates, assuming we keep on having these many presidential primary debates or whatever. You have to do something that lets you stand out. And oftentimes that's being outrageous. And oftentimes you get rewarded for that.
So that kind of gets at this whole question of regardless of, well, there's a immediate question of how long is Trump personally going to be around, and is him potentially running for election in 4 years going to be really come to fruition or not? But then the bigger question about Trump versus Trumpism, and I think you're kind of addressing that. I'm curious to know a little bit more about what does this mean for Mike DeWine in 2022, and how serious a threat does essentially, I'll just say Trumpism, play in Mike DeWine being able to get renominated for governor, and then what does that do to the overall electoral landscape in Ohio 2 years from now?
I'll jump in. My crystal ball says Jim Renacci, who was a congressman out of Wadsworth, which nobody knows where that's at, he would like to run. He might run. He's a multimillionaire, but he got to be a multimillionaire but not spend his own money. So there's a good chance he runs. Jim Jordan is talked about, but I'm not sure he's going to run because he obviously looked at the narrow margin and the chance of toppling Nancy Pelosi in 2022. There's obviously some former or current state reps who might want to run, but in some ways for Mike DeWine, if he's got 3 or 4 different opponents, none of which have significant name ID or money, it's pretty easy to predict what's going to happen in the primary. He'll win. Portman could get a primary opponent. I'm not sure how effective they can be because people forget how big Ohio is in terms of the size of the population, the multimedia markets. And then I don't know who the Democrats are going to come up with because obviously their farm team is kind of limited. They don't have a state auditor or attorney general who could run for governor, and a lot of the mayors are not interested in doing it. So if I was betting, I'd bet on Mike DeWine because the history has been usually if somebody runs against the incumbent Republican office holder, there's usually several candidates and they divide up the vote.
You know, I think a year from now, the attractiveness of challenging Mike DeWine by some from the right will be less so. Presumably, the virus will be vaccinated, the economy will be somewhat back to closer to normal. Ideally, the economy will be approaching normal. And so on what grounds would somebody from, let's say, the far right, I'm not sure that's Renacci, but challenge him? It doesn't sound very credible right now. Now, if everything falls apart and you know, we're actually 10 months from now, a year from now, still dealing with you know, disaster in the economy and public health, that's a very different situation. But right now, you know, when I said before, the Democrats are at the mercy in Ohio of Republicans screwing up, that's exactly the scenario that somehow a really conservative, I don't want to use the, well, nut job somehow manages to defeat Mike DeWine, then the Democrats might say, oh my goodness, we've got a chance. They've nominated somebody too far on the right side. But the Democrats have to still offer a candidate who can take advantage of that situation. But my guess is that that a year from now we won't be talking about these kinds of intra-party challenges, because presumably we'll be on a pathway that leads to a better quality of life in Ohio.
Well, thank you for your perspective on that. Let me just ask if there's anybody else who has a question. Again, you can put your name in the chat. If it's easier for you, just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Now, you know, you had mentioned Trumpism.
Yeah.
And actually, you know, when you actually start dissecting what Trumpism is, there's some policy components to that are actually attractive to some people, depending on how you frame it. You know, if you say, for example, that part of that is that countries have a right to have borders that are legitimate borders, that where you can control who enters your country and all of that. You know, a lot of people would say that's very reasonable. If you say here that we got to keep the the slurs that, you know, that's not a reasonable way of talking about it. You know, Trump can certainly talk about getting tough on China. He can talk about or Trumpism can talk about that. You know, there's an element of economic populism to Trumpism. So it really depends on what are the elements. But I think the question you're asking what if Trump decides, and he's already threatened Mike DeWine, and he's threatened a few other people. What if he says he's going to be an active participant in recruiting candidates to run against disloyal Republicans? And he's willing to campaign for these candidates. And he'll never throw his own money into it, just like Renee, but he could then be a disruptive force in Republican politics. I don't know what he's going to choose to do. He may have other things that will keep him busy, including legal cases in Manhattan and New York City. We're still waiting to see what kinds of pardons are issued and whether or not he can pardon himself. But I can imagine that if he decides he's going to be a thorn on the Biden administration and just make life miserable, well, there are other people who will say, well, we'll make his life miserable too.
All right, any other questions? We're just about at the end of our hour. Well, I think that does it. Any final comments before we wrap up?
I might mention, I think that the good news is public employees, particularly healthcare, the people on the front line, safety forces, have got a lot of pump up legitimately in the last few years. And I'm not sure how that affects budgets and what people approve, but clearly folks know that people on the front lines and safety and other things are valuable. But the difficulty, does the state of Ohio have the money to do added funding in some of those areas? And maybe I mentioned this earlier, but there's a unique circumstance because I think all of the state union contracts are up in the next few months. So it's not only the budget, but it's other things. And there's a lot of school districts that, like here in Columbus, didn't go for a tax levy this year because they were in pretty good shape budget-wise, but when did they go next? So there's a lot of questions in terms of how public services are performed. And also in the legislature, they're going to have to deal a lot more with the whole issue of urban areas versus the rural and other parts of Ohio, because economic development, if you look at central Ohio, it's been like a Sunbelt area. There's other areas that have shrunk significantly in population. I'm originally from Coshocton County, and when you're there, you can see the challenges in other parts of Ohio. So there's no shortage of issues to talk about in the future. But again, unless Herb has magic and on Christmas Day gets a printing press for the governor, they're going to have to deal with the money they have.
But Terry, following on your point, I think one of the benefits of what we've been through is a greater appreciation for public servants and people in public service, and a greater appreciation that public servants doesn't mean necessarily legislators or elected official. It's all those other categories of people on the front lines. And one of the things I found, given your role in OEA, how many times when you saw interviews on TV of parents whose kids were now being taught virtually, and the parents wound up saying, oh my God, I now know what teachers have to put up with. They should all be paid $1 million. And that's not going to happen. But I think there is a greater appreciation for the kinds of services and sacrifices that so many people make in the healthcare setting, in the public security setting, in education and things like that. And maybe that's something that can help improve the tenor of our discussion of these issues as we go forward.
Well, that is certainly an uplifting note to end on, and I thank you for that. During these, this has been quite a year unlike any other. So I'm glad we're able to end on a note of optimism. So thank you both, Herb.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
We really appreciate it. If everybody could give a virtual round of applause today's speakers, and be watching your email for, again, more information on how to register for our January program on implicit bias. Thanks all for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day.